The dog was already at the door when the orderly tried to walk past. No bark, no growl. The animal simply shifted its weight from one shoulder to the other, and the orderly stopped walking. He could not explain afterward why he stopped. He just did. There was something in the dog's eyes that made forward motion feel like a very bad idea. Room 114 was at the end of the pediatric ward's east corridor, and for the past 41 hours, nothing had entered or exited that room except the charge nurse, Patricia Dawson, and a single tray of food that came back untouched. The dog sat outside that door the way a stone sits at the base of a mountain. It was simply there. It had always been there. It would, apparently, always be there. His name was K7. He wore a dark vest with a small panel of reinforced plating along his sides. His coat was a mix of tan and black, the kind of coloring that looked almost ordinary, until you noticed the stillness underneath it. Most dogs fidget. They scratch, they shift, they follow movement with their eyes out of simple animal curiosity. K7 did none of those things. He watched the door to room 114 the way a man watches something he has been told to protect with his life. Because that was exactly what he had been told. Inside room 114, a 7-year-old girl named Lily Hargrove lay in a hospital bed with a white blanket pulled up to her chin and her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She had a bandage along her left arm and a small bruise on her jaw that had faded from purple to a dull yellow over the past 2 days. The nurses who came in to check her vitals always spoke to her in soft voices, the way adults speak to children who have been through something they cannot yet understand. Lily understood more than they thought. She knew her mother was not coming. She did not know all the details, but she knew the way children know things that no one tells them directly, absorbing the truth from the silence around it, from the careful way the nurses avoided certain questions, from the look on Patricia Dawson's face the one time Lily had asked when her mom would visit. Patricia had touched her hand and said, "You just rest, sweetheart." And that was how Lily knew. She had not cried since the first night. She was saving something, though she could not have named what. She lay very still and listened to the sounds of the ward outside her door, the rolling of carts, the low voices of nurses, the occasional beeping of a machine somewhere down the hall. And sometimes, in the quieter moments, she heard the soft shift of paws on linoleum just outside her door, and she felt, in some place deeper than thought, that she was not alone. She did not know that the dog outside her door had once slept at the foot of her father's bunk in a forward operating base 8,000 miles away. She did not know that K7 had been on 4 deployments, that he had cleared buildings and tracked signals through terrain that would end most animals in an afternoon, that he wore a designation instead of a name because the unit he belonged to did not put names on anything that might appear in documents. She knew only that he was there, and it helped. Patricia Dawson had been a charge nurse for 19 years, and she had never in her career organized an entire ward around a dog. She had also never been shown credentials like the ones the man had produced on the night Lily arrived. He was tall, with the kind of posture that does not come from good habits but from years of being told that how you hold yourself communicates everything. He wore civilian clothes that somehow still looked like a uniform. He had shown his identification to Patricia, and she had read it twice, and then he had said, in a voice that was entirely calm and entirely without room for discussion, "Nobody goes in, nobody." Then he had left. Patricia had stood in the hallway for a full 30 seconds before she moved again. Then she had quietly rearranged the ward's access protocols, redirected 2 visiting physicians to different routes, and told the overnight staff to let the dog be. Nobody had argued. The admissions file for room 114 listed the patient as Lily Harmon. The surname was false. Patricia knew this because she had processed the real paperwork, the sealed kind with a federal flag attached, the kind that came with a direct contact number she was told to call only in a genuine emergency and never to share. The girl's real name was Hargrove. Her father was Captain Declan Hargrove, and that was all Patricia was told about him, except that he was currently unreachable, and that the dog outside room 114 was his, and that the dog's judgment was to be trusted. Patricia had spent 19 years trusting her own judgment and the judgment of licensed physicians. She had never been asked to trust a dog's. She trusted it. On the second afternoon, a man from the hospital's administrative office came to ask about the animal, citing questions about liability and hospital policy. K7 looked at him. The man completed his sentence, waited for a response that did not come, looked at the dog one more time, and decided the liability question could wait until tomorrow. Tomorrow came. He did not return. The ward had its own rhythm, and K7 had become part of it, the way unusual things sometimes do when they persist long enough. The pediatric nurses brought stuffed animals to the children at the end of the hall. The maintenance crew buffed the floors at midnight. The vending machine near the stairwell rattled when someone selected item B4. And at the end of the east corridor, in front of the door to room 1114, a Belgian Malinois in a tactical vest sat without moving, and watched everything and allowed nothing. On the third day, a young nurse named Adrienne Solis arrived for her evening shift and was told by the outgoing staff, in the casual tone of people relaying established fact, that the dog outside 114 was not to be disturbed, that no one unauthorized was to approach room 114, and that if anyone asked too many questions about the girl inside, Adrienne was to call Patricia immediately, no matter the hour. Adrienne was 26 years old. She had transferred to this hospital from a smaller facility in another city 2 weeks ago. She was still learning where the linen closet was. She was still learning which elevator was fastest on the overnight shift. She was not prepared, in any sense of the word, for what the next 48 hours would ask of her. She walked past K7 that first evening and stopped, the way the orderly had stopped, for reasons she could not immediately name. She looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. She had the strange sensation that she was being assessed, and that the assessment was thorough, and that it mattered. K7 looked away first, back to the door. Adrienne walked on. She checked the charts of the patients in her care, administered medication, spoke softly to a 4-year-old boy who was frightened of the dark and needed someone to stay for a few minutes until his breathing steadied. She was good at this. She had always been good at knowing when to speak and when to simply sit. At 9 that evening, she brought a small cup of water to just outside room 1114 and set it quietly on the floor near K7. She did not try to pet him. She did not say anything. She simply placed the cup where he could reach it and walked away. He drank from it 10 minutes later. She did not see him do it. She was in another room checking vitals, but when she walked past again at 9:30, the cup was empty and K7's eyes were back on the door, and everything was exactly as it had been. Except that when she passed, his tail moved once, just once, low and brief, the smallest possible acknowledgement. Adrienne filed that away the way she was beginning to file everything on this ward, quietly, carefully, in the pocket of her attention where things waited until they were needed. At 10:15 that night, she passed the window that looked out over the parking structure across the street. She stopped because the light was wrong. There was a pale glow coming from the 3rd floor of the structure, near the corner pillar, the kind of glow that belongs to a phone screen or a low dashboard light, the kind that appears only when something is sitting very still in a place that should be empty. She stood at the window for a moment. The glow did not move. She thought about saying something to Patricia. Patricia had already left for the night. She thought about saying something to the security desk downstairs. She did not. Not yet. She told herself it was probably nothing. A couple parked late. Someone on a phone call who did not want to go home. She had seen stranger things in parking structures near hospitals. People sat in cars outside hospitals all the time, holding on to ordinary life for a few more minutes before coming inside to face something hard. She walked back to the nursing station. She wrote up her notes. She glanced at the east corridor, where K7 was a dark shape at the far end, motionless against the light of the hallway. She glanced back at the window. The glow was still there. She picked up her pen, set it down, picked it up again. She did not know yet that the glow had been there since the previous night. She did not know that the same vehicle, a plain dark sedan with no visible license plate distinguishable from this distance, had been parked in exactly that spot since a few hours after Lily Hargrove arrived at this hospital under a false name. She did not know that whoever was in that car already knew the name on the door was wrong. She did not know any of this yet, but she wrote down the time in her personal notebook, the small one she kept in her left pocket, separate from her clinical notes. She wrote, 10:15, 3rd floor, corner pillar, light in the car, has not moved. Then she capped her pen and went back to work. K7 did not sleep that night. He never slept on duty. He sat in front of room 114 and he breathed and he watched. And somewhere behind that door, a small girl with a bruise on her jaw stared at the ceiling, and listened to the sound of the ward, and felt, just barely, that she was being kept. The night passed slowly. Nothing happened, which was, for now, the most important thing in the world. The two men arrived the following afternoon, at 10 minutes past 2. They walked in through the main entrance of Mercy General, with the kind of stride that belongs to people who have walked into many hospitals and never once felt out of place in them. They wore jackets that were dark but not black, the color of something that wanted to look official without committing to any particular uniform. Their lanyards said Regional Healthcare Compliance Office in clean, professional lettering, and their identification cards, when they presented them at the front desk, passed the surface check without any visible difficulty. The woman at the front desk, whose name was Gloria, directed them to the 4th floor and told them to check in with the charge nurse when they arrived. They thanked her pleasantly and took the elevator. When they stepped off on the 4th floor, the taller of the two men, whose name according to his lanyard was Arthur Crane, immediately looked toward the east corridor. He did not look at the nursing station. He did not look at the patient board on the wall. He looked at the east corridor, and then he looked at K7, and then he looked at the door behind K7, and for just a moment, something moved across his face that did not belong on the face of a regional compliance officer. Then it was gone, and he was walking to the nursing station, and he was smiling, and he was asking in a very reasonable voice whether they might be able to speak with whoever was responsible for the patient in room 1114. The nurse at the station, a young man named Oliver who had been on this ward for 3 months and was still slightly startled every time he passed K7, told them he would have to reach the charge nurse and ask them to wait. They waited. They were very good at waiting. Patricia Dawson arrived from the break room 7 minutes later, still holding her coffee, and she listened to what Arthur Crane explained, which was that their office had received a referral regarding a minor patient admitted under irregular circumstances, and that it was standard procedure to conduct a welfare assessment in such cases, and that they would need brief access to the room to confirm the child's well-being and document her current condition. Patricia listened to all of this without any change in her expression. When Arthur Crane had finished, she asked to see their documentation. He produced a folder. Inside was a printed form with official headers and the signatures of 2 administrators. The paperwork was thorough. It had watermarks and reference numbers, and a case code that, to anyone who did not know exactly what they were looking at, appeared entirely legitimate. Patricia took the folder. She read every line. She did not rush. Arthur Crane and his partner, a shorter man named Gary Holt who had not yet said a single word, stood in front of the nursing station and waited while she read, and they did not fidget, and they did not check their phones, and they did not look at each other. They looked at the east corridor. Patricia handed the folder back. "I need to contact our legal department before granting access to a minor patient," she said. "Standard protocol on our end, you understand?" "Of course," Arthur Crane said. "We're happy to wait." Patricia went to her office and closed the door. She picked up her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to the hospital's legal counsel, who did not answer. The second was to the number on the sealed file, the one she had been told to call only in a genuine emergency. It rang 4 times. No one answered. The line went to a recording that was not a voicemail but simply silence, followed by a tone. She left no message. There was no guidance in the instructions for what to do when no one answered. She came back out. Arthur Crane and Gary Holt were still standing at the nursing station. They had not moved toward the corridor. They had not approached K7. They had simply stood and waited, which, Patricia was beginning to understand, was something they were trained to do. "I'm afraid I can't grant access today," she told them. "I need written authorization from our administration before allowing any third-party assessment of a pediatric patient. You can submit your request through our formal channel, and we'll respond within 24 hours. Arthur Crane nodded slowly. He was not angry. He was not even surprised. He simply accepted this information the way a person accepts a weather delay, as an inconvenience that has been factored into the plan. "We'll be in touch," he said. They left. Patricia watched them go to the elevator, and she watched the elevator doors close, and then she turned and looked at the east corridor, and K7 was watching her. She walked to the corridor's edge. She stopped a few feet from him. He regarded her with those flat, serious eyes. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said quietly. K7 said nothing, because K7 was a dog, and also because there was nothing to say. He turned back to the door. Patricia went back to work. By 4 in the afternoon, Arthur Crane and Gary Holt had returned twice. Each time their pretext was slightly different. First, it was a follow-up question about documentation. Then it was a request to speak with the hospital's patient advocate. They were unfailingly polite. They signed the visitor log each time. They asked their questions and accepted their answers, and left when asked, and returned when they felt it was appropriate. Oliver from the nursing station began to recognize the sound of the elevator opening. He would look up every time, and half the time it was them, and he began to feel a low, steady unease that he could not quite explain to himself, and so did not mention to anyone. Adrian arrived for her shift at 5. She was briefed by Patricia personally, in the break room, with the door closed. Patricia told her about the 2 men, the paperwork, the calls she had not been able to complete. She told Adrian to trust nothing that had not been confirmed through the sealed file's contact number, and she told her that if anything changed during the night, anything at all, she was to call Patricia at home. Adrian nodded. She asked one question. Has anyone been able to reach the girl's father? Patricia looked at her. No. Adrian nodded again. She did not ask anything else. When she walked past K7 that evening, she did not bring water this time. She simply paused for a moment beside him. He did not look at her. He was watching the elevator now, in addition to the door, dividing his attention between the 2 points of entry at either end of the corridor. Adrian noticed this. She noted that his positioning had shifted slightly from where it had been the previous night, and she understood, in a quiet, instinctive way, that he had made a tactical adjustment. She went to the window at the end of the corridor and looked out at the parking structure. The sedan was back. 3rd floor, corner pillar. She could see it from here, the shape of it in the dimming afternoon light, sitting in a spot that faced directly at the hospital's east side. She wrote the time in her notebook, 5:22. She went to the window again at 6, at 6:45, at 7:30. The sedan did not move. By 8, there was a 3rd man with Arthur Crane and Gary Holt. He had arrived separately, and he was older than the other 2, with the kind of face that has been kept deliberately unremarkable, the kind of face you would not be able to describe in detail afterward, because it had been arranged to give you nothing to hold on to. The 3 of them were in the family waiting area near the elevator, and they were speaking quietly, and they were not looking at the nursing station. They were looking at the east corridor. Oliver called Patricia at home. Patricia said she would make some calls and call him back. She sounded, for the first time since any of this had started, like someone who was not entirely sure what to do next. Oliver hung up and looked at the 3 men in the waiting area, and then he looked at K7 at the end of the corridor, and K7 was looking back at him, not at the men, at Oliver. Oliver straightened up. He walked to the waiting area and told the 3 men that visiting hours on the pediatric ward ended at 8 and that they would need to leave. The older man said that they were not there to visit a patient, that they were conducting official business, and that they would leave when their business was complete. Oliver said that this ward had a strict quiet policy after 8 and that he would need to ask the security desk to assist them if they were unable to leave voluntarily. There was a pause. The 3 men looked at each other. Then, without another word, they stood and walked to the elevator. The doors opened. They went in. Oliver stood very still until the elevator indicator showed them descending. Then he sat down, very carefully, in his chair, and realized that his hands were not entirely steady. At the nursing station, his phone was ringing. It was Patricia, calling back. She had reached someone. She did not say who. She said only that Adrian should be aware that the paperwork the men had presented, while it appeared legitimate on the surface, might not hold up under formal legal review, and that under no circumstances was access to room 114 to be granted to any individual not cleared through the sealed files protocol. Adrian, who was standing near the station and heard most of this, wrote something in her small notebook. She tore the page out carefully and folded it and placed it in her left pocket. She went to the window at 9 o'clock. The sedan was still there. And then, between one breath and the next, it was not. The spot where it had been sitting was empty. The sedan was gone, not driven away in the time between her checks, but simply absent now, as if it had never been there at all. Adrian stood at the window for a long time. She did not know whether this was better or worse. She thought about it for the length of 3 slow breaths. She looked at the empty parking space. She looked at the hospital entrance 5 floors below. She looked at the elevator at the end of the ward. Then she went back to work, and she kept her phone in her hand, and she checked every corner of the ward with the kind of quiet care that looks like ordinary diligence to anyone who does not know what they are watching. At the end of the east corridor, K7 had risen to his feet. He was no longer sitting. He was standing in front of the door to room 114, and the quality of his stillness had changed in a way that was not visible from a distance, but that Adrian felt when she passed, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Something had shifted. Something in the information that reached him through means she would not be able to name had told him that the situation was no longer what it had been an hour ago. He did not make a sound. He stood, and he waited, and the ward's fluorescent lights hummed their single endless note overhead, and Lily Hargrove lay in room 114 with her eyes open, listening, and the night deepened around all of them. At 9:47 in the evening, 4 of them came. Arthur Crane, Gary Holt, and the older man whose name no one on the ward had been given, came through the stairwell door at the end of the corridor rather than the elevator. They had learned from the previous visit. They knew Oliver watched the elevator. The stairwell door opened with a soft click, and they were in the corridor before anyone at the nursing station had time to register the sound. The 4th person was a woman. She walked ahead of the men, and this too was deliberate, because a woman in a business suit carrying a document folder reads differently than 3 men in dark jackets, and the people who had put this operation together had understood that from the beginning. Her name was not on any lanyard. She carried a leather document holder under one arm and moved with the focused, unhurried energy of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times and expects it to take approximately 9 minutes. She was wrong about that. The corridor was dim, the way hospital corridors are at night. The overhead lights turned to their lower evening setting, only a few of the ceiling panels fully lit. The nursing station sat to the left, where Oliver looked up from his screen and went very still. The east corridor opened to the right, stretching toward room 1114, where K7 stood in front of the door. The woman did not hesitate. She walked directly toward the east corridor. K7 turned to face her. He did not move from in front of the door. He simply reoriented, so that now he was looking at her, and she was looking at him, and there was approximately 12 feet of corridor between them. He did not growl. He did not lower his head into an aggressive posture. He simply stood, and the weight of his attention landed on her like something physical. She stopped walking, not because she had decided to stop, because her body had made that decision slightly ahead of her mind. Behind her, Arthur Crane moved to the nursing station and placed the document folder in front of Oliver. Oliver did not open it. He stared at it. "This is a court-authorized welfare assessment order," Arthur Crane said. His voice was professional and warm and entirely without urgency. "It grants our office immediate access to the patient in room 114, pending confirmation of next of kin availability. It's been signed by a district family court judge. You can see the seal on page 2. Oliver did not look at page 2. He looked at Arthur Crane. "I need to call the charge nurse," Oliver said. "Of course," Arthur Crane said. "We can wait." The older man positioned himself near the stairwell door they had come through. Gary Holt stood between the elevator and the nursing station, hands in his pockets, watching the corridor with the mild expression of a person waiting for a bus. Oliver reached for the phone. The woman in the business suit had not moved. She was still standing at the entrance to the east corridor, and K7 was still standing 12 feet from her, and neither of them had blinked. She said, quietly, without turning around, "How long has this animal been unsupervised on a pediatric ward?" Nobody answered her. She took one step forward. K7 rose from his standing position to something slightly more. It was not dramatic. His posture did not change in any sudden or obvious way, but the air in the corridor changed, the way the air changes when something that has been waiting patiently decides that patience has a limit. The woman stopped again. Oliver had Patricia on the phone. He was speaking quietly and quickly. Patricia, at home, was already out of her chair and reaching for her car keys as she listened. 3 more nurses had appeared at the edges of the corridor. They had come out of patient rooms and from around corners, drawn by something they could not have named, some alteration in the ward's atmosphere that announced itself in a frequency below ordinary sound. They stood and watched. The older man near the stairwell said something quietly to Gary Holt. Gary Holt nodded once. The woman in the business suit opened her document folder and removed a single page. She held it up so that it was visible. "This is a signed order from a family court judge," she said, addressing the corridor in general. "It supersedes any administrative hold on this room. We have the legal authority to enter. We are not asking for permission. We are notifying you as a courtesy." She took another step forward. K7 moved. Not toward her. He moved 2 steps to the right, so that his body was fully centered in the corridor, blocking not just the door but the entire width of the passage. He was not a large dog by any standard of purely physical measurement, but he occupied that space the way something much larger would have, with a total and absolute certainty that made the corridor feel like it had narrowed to exactly the width of his chest. The woman stopped. She had now stopped 3 times. Each time she had stopped, she had told herself she was simply being strategic, assessing the situation, maintaining control of the approach. Each time, she had simply stopped because stopping was the only thing her body was willing to do. She looked at the dog for a long moment. Then she looked back at Arthur Crane. Arthur Crane turned to Oliver. "This order is legally binding," he said. "If the hospital prevents its execution, the hospital assumes liability. I want that on record." Oliver said, "Understood. Patricia is on her way in. I need you to wait." "We've waited," Arthur Crane said, and for the first time since he had arrived, something in his voice changed. Not dramatically, just enough to show that the professional warmth was a layer, and underneath it was something with edges. In the corridor, Gary Holt had moved slightly toward the east passage. K7's head turned in his direction. Gary Holt stopped moving. The woman in the business suit said, "Someone needs to remove this animal from the corridor." Nobody moved. Oliver was on the phone again. Not with Patricia this time, but with the hospital's security desk. 2 security officers were already on their way up from the ground floor. He had called them 11 minutes ago, when he first saw the 3 men come through the stairwell door, and he had not told anyone he had done this because he had not wanted Arthur Crane to know. The pediatric ward at night is not a place of noise or speed. Its rhythms are slow and measured and careful, and the people who work there have learned to move without startling anyone who is already frightened. But Adrienne Solis, coming out of the supply closet at the far end of the ward, did not look like someone who was startled. She looked like someone who had been expecting this. She had the small notebook in her left hand. Her right hand was at her side. She walked the length of the ward without hurrying, and the people in the corridor made space for her, the way corridors make space for people who know exactly where they are going. She passed the nursing station. She passed Arthur Crane and Gary Holt. She passed the older man near the stairwell door. None of them tried to stop her, partly because she was a nurse on her own ward, and partly because there was something in her manner that made stopping her feel beside the point, like trying to stop a clock from ticking by standing in the room. She walked into the east corridor. She walked past the woman in the business suit without looking at her. She stopped in front of K7. The dog looked at her. She looked at the dog. She was not his handler. She had known him for less than 2 days. She had given him 1 cup of water and received 1 movement of his tail. She reached into her pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. She read from it quietly, just the last 4 words of what was written there, in a voice low enough that no one else in the corridor could hear. K7 held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he sat. He did not move away from the door. He sat directly in front of it, in the same position he had held for days, and he looked at Adrienne, and something passed between them that she would not be able to describe for a long time, and would not try to. She turned around. She looked at the woman in the business suit, at Arthur Crane, at Gary Holt, at the older man near the stairwell. She looked at all of them in turn, and her expression was quiet and even, and entirely without fear. "You need to leave this ward," Adrienne said. The woman opened her mouth. "Your document is not what you say it is," Adrienne said. "I made a phone call an hour ago. I spoke to someone who confirmed that no family court in this district issued any order relating to this patient. I have that confirmation in writing. And I have the name of the person who provided it. She held up the piece of paper. She did not give them time to respond. The security team is currently reviewing the access logs for this building. A federal contact has been notified. If you are still on this ward in the next 4 minutes, everything after that is no longer my responsibility or the hospital's. The woman stared at her. Arthur Crane looked at the older man. The older man gave a small, almost invisible nod. Arthur Crane picked up the document folder from the nursing station. He straightened his jacket. "We'll be in contact through proper channels," he said, and his voice had returned to its professional register, smooth and unhurried, as if the last 12 minutes had not happened. They left, Arthur Crane first, then Gary Holt, then the older man. The woman in the business suit folded her document back into her leather holder and followed them to the elevator without looking at anyone. The elevator doors opened. They went in. The doors closed. The ward was silent. Oliver let out a breath he had been holding for a very long time. One of the nurses who had been watching from the corridor doorway touched the wall beside her as if checking that it was solid. At the nursing station, 2 security officers arrived from the stairwell, slightly out of breath. Oliver looked at them. "They just left," he said, "but I need you to stay on this floor for the rest of the night." They nodded. Adrian walked back to the nursing station. She sat down in the chair beside Oliver's and placed the piece of paper and her notebook on the desk in front of her. She was breathing carefully, the way you breathe when you are making sure your hands remain steady. Oliver looked at her. "Who did you call?" She looked at the piece of paper. On it was a name and a phone number, and below those, 4 words written in her own handwriting. "Someone who knew the dog's signal," she said. Oliver waited for more. Adrian did not give more. She picked up the piece of paper and folded it and put it back in her pocket. At the end of the east corridor, K7 had returned to his standing position in front of room 114. His attention had already moved past what had happened. It was on the door again, and on the ward around him, and on the elevator, and the stairwell entrance, and the window at the end of the hall where the parking structure across the street sat empty in the dark. The sedan had not come back. Inside room 114, Lily Hargrove had heard the voices in the corridor, the shifting of feet, the long silence that followed. She had not been able to make out words, but she had heard Adrian's voice at one point, and she had heard something she could not identify afterward but which she would later describe, when she was old enough to find the language for it, as the sound of someone standing between you and something bad. She had pulled the white blanket higher. She had closed her eyes. She had listened to the familiar sound of paws on linoleum just outside her door, the small, steady shift of a dog who was still there, who had always been there, who was not going anywhere. She had slept. The supply room was at the end of the ward, away from the main corridor, with a narrow window that looked out over the maintenance yard behind the building rather than the street. It was not a comfortable room. It smelled of antiseptic and paper, and the particular dry warmth of storage spaces with poor ventilation. There was a single chair in the corner that had been placed there by some nurse years ago and had never been removed, and Adrian sat in it with her phone in both hands, and the door closed, and the overhead light turned to its lowest setting. She had been making calls for a long time. The first call she had made was to Patricia, which had lasted 3 minutes, and had ended with Patricia saying she was coming in, and Adrian saying she did not need to come in yet, that the situation was stable for now, and Patricia saying that was not actually Adrian's decision to make, and that she would be there in 40 minutes. The second call she had made was to the number on the sealed file. This time someone answered. The voice was male and direct and spoke with the clipped precision of a person for whom wasted words are a professional failing. He had asked Adrian 3 questions. She had answered all 3 accurately and without elaboration. He had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said something that she wrote down on the folded piece of paper in her left pocket. The third call she had made was to a different number, which she had found in the sealed file itself. The sealed file was on the hospital's restricted server, behind 2 layers of access codes and a federal flag that was supposed to prevent anyone below a certain clearance level from opening it. Adrian had opened it. She had done this not through any technical ability or special access, but through a piece of information Patricia had mentioned in passing during a handover 3 days ago, a note about the access sequence that Patricia had not intended as an instruction, and that Adrian had not intended to use. She had used it. She had opened the file, and she had read it, and she had sat very still for almost 4 minutes afterward. Then she had made the third call. The man who answered the third number had a different kind of voice than the first man. Where the first was clipped and functional, this one was slower, heavier, with the particular weariness of someone who has been bearing weight for a long time and has become accustomed to the shape of it. He had asked her how she had found this number. She had told him. There had been another silence, different from the first man's silence, less assessing and more tired. He had told her the dog's name meant the seventh dog in a specialized unit sequence. He had told her what K7 was trained to respond to, not commands exactly, but signals, specific signals that his handler had taught him, and that had been passed along in the file in the event of an emergency. He had told her what 4 words would communicate to K7 that the situation had been cleared through official means. He had told her his name, and he had told her his rank, and he had told her that what she had found in that file was more serious than she understood. The men who came to that ward tonight, he said, are not from any compliance office. Adrian had already worked that out. Declan is being notified, the man said. He will not be reachable for confirmation of that for several hours. In the meantime, I need you to understand something. Tell me, she said. The document those people brought was a fabrication. A very good one, but fabricated. The person who created it had access to the patient's real admission information, not the false name, the real name. Adrian absorbed this. That information is only available to people on this ward, he said. The supply room was very quiet. I understand, Adrian said. She had already thought about this. She had been thinking about it since she noticed, during the second visit of Arthur Crane and Gary Holt, that they had asked about access and documentation and procedural authority, and they had never once used Lily's name, not the false name, not the real name, either name. They had not asked how the patient was doing, or whether she was in pain, or whether she was frightened. She had thought about who on the ward knew the real name. The list was short, Patricia, obviously. Oliver had processed the admission flag and had access to the restricted system, though he had told Adrian he had not looked at the protected file. The overnight physician who had treated Lily on arrival, and one other person. A nurse who had been on duty during the first night, a woman named Claire Stanton, who had been transferred to the overnight shift 3 days ago, and who was not on the ward this evening. Adrian had not told the general about Claire Stanton. Not yet. She told him now. Another silence. Longer this time. She needs to be found, he said. Not tonight, but soon. Don't approach her yourself. I won't, Adrian said. You did well, the general said. It was not flattery. It was a statement of fact, delivered the way someone delivers the weather. The girl's father, Adrian said. Is he all right? He's coming, the general said. That's all I can tell you. The call ended. Adrian sat in the chair in the supply room and looked at the narrow window and the dark outside it. The maintenance yard was empty, lit by a single overhead lamp that threw a circle of pale light onto the concrete below. Nothing moved in the yard. Somewhere above her, several floors up, the pediatric ward was quiet. She unfolded the piece of paper and read what she had written, the general's name at the top, the phone number beside it, and below those, the 4 words she had spoken to K7 in the corridor. She looked at those 4 words for a long moment. Hargrove sends word. She folded the paper. She put it back in her pocket. She went back to work. The ward was calm in the way that follows crisis, a provisional calm that everyone inhabits with slightly more care than usual, the way people walk carefully on ice that has been declared safe but feels uncertain underfoot. Oliver was at the nursing station, his coffee untouched, writing up his incident report with the careful precision of someone who understands that tonight will be reviewed in detail by people far above his pay grade. The 2 security officers were positioned at either end of the ward, and their presence made the whole floor feel like it was breathing more slowly. Patricia arrived at 12:30, still in her coat. She went directly to the nursing station, read Oliver's notes, read Adrian's incident documentation, looked at the folded piece of paper that Adrian had placed on the desk, and then removed without explanation, and then sat down in the break room and called the number from the sealed file herself. The call lasted 19 minutes. When she came out, Her expression was the expression of someone who has been given information that has reorganized a significant portion of what they previously understood. She looked at Adrian, who was charting at the other end of the station. "You opened the file," Patricia said. "Yes," Adrian said. Patricia looked at her for a long time. "You could lose your job for that." "I know," Adrian said. "The general said you shouldn't lose your job for that," Patricia said. "He was quite clear about it." Adrian did not smile, exactly, but something in her face shifted slightly. Patricia sat down. She looked at the incident report. She looked at the east corridor, where K7 was visible in the dim lighting, standing in front of room 114, as he had been standing for days. "Claire Stanton," Patricia said. "Yes," Adrian said. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She called in sick 2 days ago. Then, she asked to be moved to overnight shifts. I thought she needed the schedule adjustment. She paused. I authorized it. Adrian said nothing. "The general's team will handle it," Patricia said. It was not a question. "Yes," Adrian said. The rest of the night moved slowly and without incident. The security officers stayed on the floor. No one came through the elevator or the stairwell doors. The ward's children slept, or tried to, in the particular shallow way that hospital sleep works, hovering between rest and alertness, bodies healing in the space between one thing and another. At 2 in the morning, Adrian passed room 114 on her rounds. K7 looked at her. She stopped. She had started doing this, stopping for a moment each time she passed him, not to do anything, just to be there briefly, the way you might pause near a fire on a cold night, without needing to say anything about it. "He's coming," she said quietly. She did not know if dogs understood sentences. She suspected K7 understood more than sentences. His tail moved. Once, low and brief. She went on. At 2:45, she stood at the window at the end of the corridor and looked out at the parking structure across the street. The third-floor corner was empty. The whole structure was empty. The street below was empty in the way streets are empty at this hour, not abandoned, but simply waiting, holding the night between one use and the next. She stood there for a little while. She thought about the 4 words she had spoken to a dog in a corridor. She thought about a sealed file she had had no business opening. She thought about a small girl in a room behind a door, sleeping now, finally sleeping, unaware of most of what had happened in the last several hours on her behalf. She thought about a man somewhere in the dark between here and wherever he had been, moving toward this ward with the focused single-mindedness of someone who has been given one set of coordinates and has converted his entire self into the act of reaching them. She did not know Declan Hargrove. She had read his name in a file. She had heard a general speak about him in the tone that people use for someone they trust completely. She did not know what he looked like or how he spoke, or what the particular weight of his silence was like in a room. She knew only that a dog had been waiting for him for 4 days, and that the dog did not wait for anyone or anything with that kind of patience without reason. She went back to the nursing station. She sat down. She poured herself a cup of water. She picked up her pen. She wrote the time in her notebook, 2:47. She wrote one more thing below it, for no reason she could have explained, simply because it felt true, and she had nowhere else to put it. Sometimes holding the line is the whole job. She capped her pen. She went back to work. The stairwell door at the end of the north corridor opened at 3:19 in the morning. Not the east stairwell, which was the one the men had used, but the north one, the one that Oliver had not been watching because nobody had used the north stairwell in 4 days. It opened with a sound that was barely a sound, the soft resistance of a door that has been pulled open very slowly by someone who knows how to open doors quietly. K7's head turned. The man who came through the door was tall, and the height was not the first thing you noticed about him, nor was it the second-hand appearance of someone who had slept in transit. The wrong shoes, no coat, the particular gray quality that lives in the skin after days without proper rest. What you noticed first was the stillness. He moved through the ward with a stride that covered ground efficiently and made no sound and disturbed nothing, the stride of a person for whom moving without alerting anyone is not a technique but a reflex. He stopped at the edge of the east corridor. He saw K7. K7 saw him. For a moment, nothing happened. The dog stood in front of the door to room 1114, and the man stood at the entrance to the corridor, and the distance between them was about 30 feet of quiet hospital hallway, and neither of them moved. Declan Hargrove had not slept in 2 days in any meaningful sense. He had been pulled from a position in a region he had no permission to name, pulled with 6 hours' notice by a communication that had reached him via a relay that was supposed to be used only in the most extreme circumstances. He had moved from that position to a vehicle, from the vehicle to an airfield, from the airfield to a flight, from the flight to a car, from the car to this hospital, and he had done all of it with a focused deliberateness that had not left room for what was underneath it. Underneath it was a great deal. He had been told about the car accident in the same transmission that told him about Lily. He had been told that Lily was stable and being kept safe. He had been told who was keeping her safe, and that the situation was being handled. He had taken all of this information, and he had filed it in the part of himself that functions under pressure, the operational part, the part that takes information and converts it into movement and decisions. The other part, the part that knew what the car accident meant, that understood what was no longer waiting for him, had not been given room yet. He had not allowed it room. There was no room for it until he had confirmed with his own eyes that Lily was all right. He looked at K7. K7 looked at him. The dog took one step to the left, not away from the door, one small, precise step to the left, so that the door was no longer directly between them, so that the path to the door was open. Declan's hand went to the back of the dog's neck. He did not kneel down. He did not make a sound. He simply stood with his hand on K7's neck, in the space between one thing and the next, and the dog held still beneath his hand, and looked at nothing in particular, and allowed it. 30 seconds, perhaps less. Then Declan moved to the door of room 1114. He pushed it open slowly, the way you open a door when you need very much for the person inside to remain asleep. She was not asleep. Lily Hargrove was sitting up in the hospital bed with the white blanket pulled to her waist, and her eyes open and enormous in the low light of the room. She had the look of someone who has been listening for a very long time to sounds she could not quite identify, and has finally heard the one she was waiting for. He crossed the room in 4 steps. He sat on the edge of the bed. He put his arms around her. She did not cry. Neither did he. They held on to each other in the dim room with the machines keeping their quiet time nearby, and the ward holding still around them, and K7 positioning himself just outside the closed door in a way that stated, once again and very clearly, that this was where he was going to be. Adrian, at the nursing station, heard the stairwell door and looked up. She saw the tall man move through the ward. She watched him stop at the east corridor. She watched K7 step aside. She stood up from her chair. Then she sat back down. There was nothing to do. He was here. He was in. That was the whole of what had needed to happen. And it had happened. And the rest was not for her. The door to room 114 was closed. She looked at K7 in the corridor. He had lowered himself to his chest in front of the door, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed for the first time in 4 days. Not sleeping. Resting in the way that's possible only when the thing you have been holding has been handed to the person it belongs to. Adrian went back to her charts. She worked until 5 in the morning without interruption, the ward quiet around her, the security officers doing their quiet rounds, the building settling into the particular stillness of the hour before dawn when even hospitals seem to exhale. She did not go to the east corridor again. She did not check the window. There was nothing to see in the parking structure, and there was nothing to hear in room 114. And there was nothing more to do, except the ordinary careful work of caring for the people in her charge. At 5:15, a sound in the corridor made her look up. The door to room 114 had opened. Declan Hargrove came out alone, pulling the door shut quietly behind him. He stood in the corridor for a moment. He looked at K7, and K7 looked at him, and the communication between them was entirely wordless and entirely complete. Then he looked down the corridor toward the nursing station. He walked toward her. Adrian set down her pen. He stopped at the station. He looked at her directly, and it was the look of a person who has dispensed with everything that is not essential, and is left with the core of whatever they mean to communicate. He did not introduce himself. He did not explain who he was. She already knew. He said, "The general told me what you did." Adrian looked at him. She did not say anything. "He told me what you opened, and what you found, and who you called," he said. He told me what you said in that corridor. She waited. I owe you more than I know how to say in a hallway at 5 in the morning, he said, so I'm going to say what I can, and trust you to know the rest of it. He looked at her for a moment. His face was very tired and very controlled, the face of a person who is holding a great deal and is practiced at holding it. Thank you, he said. It was 3 words. They arrived with the full weight of everything behind them. The 4 days, the distance, the fabricated documents, the men in the corridor, the dog at the door, the child in the room, the space where a person used to be who was no longer there. Adrian nodded. He turned and went back to room 114. The door closed again, softly. Adrian picked up her pen. She sat for a moment without writing. Then she wrote the time. 5:21. She did not write anything else. At 6 o'clock, the federal investigators arrived on the 4th floor. There were 3 of them, and Patricia Dawson met them in the corridor and walked them through the events of the previous night in her careful, 19-year nurse's voice, leaving nothing out and adding nothing unnecessary. They listened. They took notes. They asked specific questions about Claire Stanton. Patricia told them everything she knew. At 6:45, the day shift arrived. Oliver handed over his notes, which were thorough and precise, and contained everything except his emotional state during the moment when Gary Holt had stopped moving because K7 had looked at him. The ward began its morning rhythm. Carts rolled. Machines beeped their gentle alarms. Children woke up and were given breakfasts, and checked by physicians, and comforted by nurses with soft voices. At 7:30, Adrian gathered her things. She stopped at the east corridor on her way out. K7 was in front of the door to room 114, sitting upright again, fully alert. She stood a few feet away from him and looked at him. He looked back at her. She reached into her pocket and took out the folded piece of paper. She held it for a moment. Then she put it back. She left the ward. 6 weeks later, a letter arrived at the hospital addressed to Adrian Solis. The envelope had no return address, and the postmark came from a base that did not appear in any public directory. She opened it at the nursing station at the start of her shift. There were 3 sentences. The first told her that Lily was well and had gone home, and had asked about the dog nearly every day. The second told her that the matter had been resolved fully, and that the people responsible for the fabricated documents would not be a concern going forward. The third sentence she read twice, and then she folded the letter along its original lines and placed it in her left pocket, with the piece of paper that was still there, the one with 4 words on it. The third sentence said, "He told me what you said to him. I don't know how you knew. Thank you for knowing." She put her hand over her pocket for a moment, pressing lightly against the paper inside it. Then she picked up her pen, and she went to work.